Good morning and welcome to Crumbs Under the Table. This is episode 6 of season 2. Normally we head in this direction, but we're going to do things a bit sneakily today. We're going to head down in this direction. We just got a car coming up towards us at the moment. So we're going to end up again in Badger Field, which is one of my favourite kind of fields to end up in because it's just really good for the dogs. But normally we go via the south and then go round down on the west side. Down on the east side. Today what we're going to do is come via the north and head up the west side. So let's make a start. We'll head down this way, which is a track that kind of leads. It's not really a sanctuary. There's donkeys down here, and we're more likely to hear them than see them, to be honest. And then there's a horse stable further down, but we don't get that far. We turn off and head to what is my left pretty quickly. I am just rambling. I have no idea why. Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't matter what direction we go in. There are always interesting sticks for Banjo to find and rearrange. I don't know what it is. There's some sort of instinct in him. He just absolutely loves a big stick. Little ones, twigs. Got to be a big one, and he's going to find it, rearrange it, put it somewhere inconvenient. And the amazing thing is he's got this incredible memory. He can have left the stick if we go a route and we don't go back for, say, a month, and he remembers exactly where he hid it. I mean, he doesn't seem to have that memory for anything else, but sticks are really important to Banjo. Very important indeed. If you want to send him gift sticks through the post, please don't bother. We're going to be looking at Proverbs 3 this morning, verses 1 to 12. And it's interesting, we're going to see there's quite a few kind of bits that resonate with the life of Jesus. In particular, we find references to or references back, I should put it that way. Two of the Gospels make a reference back, it seems, in an oblique way to this passage in terms of taking very clearly kind of concepts and ideas that are embedded in the words of verses 1 to 12 of Proverbs 3. So let's just find a good spot to get my phone out and we'll read the text. Luna! Oi! Luna, come on. Okay, so I'm going to try and do this. I'll start again. I'm going to try this one standing up. So Proverbs 3, we're going to be reading verses 1 to 12. So it starts, "My son, don't forget my teaching." Okay, so it's something for the head. "But let your heart keep my commandments." So let your heart keep my commandments. So head and heart, both of them are in there. "For length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you." So well-being, shalom, you see. So don't ignore my teaching, my instruction, think about that. Let it some way hit your heart. So that's more the emotional base. And it's good news for you, it's well-being, it's shalom, and it adds length of days. And happiness is good for your health, it really is. "Don't let kindness and truth forsake you." Now it's interesting because the word here for kindness, Hebrew, very often as we kind of move into Greek, we might choose the word grace, which is why I'm saying John's Gospel starts by saying of Jesus that in him grace and truth were made real. So there's a kind of an oblique reference here. So this is my son who's not forgetting the instruction, so he's going to be instructed. And it's always important to remember, you see, Jesus isn't some little avatar of a God. He is fully human. He lays aside the rights of divinity. He's an idea that's existed since eternity in the complex nature of who God is. He's eternally been his son. He's the firstborn in the sense of as soon as God became conscious of himself, he had wisdom. But that wisdom is emerging from some other kind of substance, which is the Father and then the Son. You get the kind of the idea. And so actually, oh look at that. That's really nice. I'm really hoping that my little action camera caught that. If you saw those birds flying past them. Anyway, what were we just saying? I've lost my thread now. But I'm not going to start again. I'm not going to start again. Oh yeah, don't let kindness. So grace and truth. So Jesus realizes grace and truth, but how does he get there? Well, he allows instruction to come into. He was coached by local rabbis, his local synagogue where they knew him. They then kind of, when he became famous, it was like, yeah, but we knew his dad. He's the son of the carpenter. You see. So bind them around your neck. So Jesus had to go through that developmental process. You see, that's the key. And he had to keep his commandments in his heart. It wasn't actually a kind of fait accompli, but there was something in him that was nurtured and guided by the Holy Spirit, and he keeps it. So bind them around your neck, write them on the tablet of your heart, and you will find favour and good understanding in the sight of God and men. So now we're suddenly sounding very much like Luke 2. Twice in Luke 2, as you kind of run through, it talks about how he's growing in wisdom. So that's about learning the instruction, and it wraps around the context of a 12-year-old being instructed and questioning the teachers in the synagogue. So he's growing in wisdom, and then it says of stature, the word is, which can often mean character, can be used for character. So he's growing in stature, and he's growing in wisdom, he's growing in character, and good understanding and favour. See, and find favour in the sight of God and man. It's that exact phrase, and favour in the sight of God and man. Twice it's used of Jesus in Luke 2 as it talks about his growing process. So here is something where, interestingly, we see Jesus is typologically represented by the wisdom of the book of Proverbs, but also the book of Proverbs is giving something about the developmental kind of process that Jesus himself went through. So trust in Yahweh with all your heart, don't lean on your own understanding. That's particularly, I'm doing the exegesis bit when I should be doing that later, so I'll just read it. Don't be wise in your own eyes, fear Yahweh and depart from evil. It's going to be health for your body and nourishment to the bones. And as I said, a good mental attitude really is good physical health. Honour Yahweh with the substance and the first fruits of all your increase. So we'll think about that, the place of generosity and giving. So your barns will be filled with plenty and your vats will overflow with new wine. My son, don't despise Yahweh's discipline, neither be weary of his reproof, because the one that Yahweh loves, he reproves, even as a father reproves the son in whom he delights. That's a great phrase, isn't it? The son in whom he delights. The son in whom he delights. So there's another reference now. You can find it in Matthew. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased, the son in whom he delights. So we're kind of finding all these resonances in these first 12 verses, but they also apply to us because Christ is the model. He's, as a perfect human, he models what mankind can be rather than what God can do. And we only have to look at the universe to see what God can do. And we look at Jesus and we get an impression of what we can be. Oh dear. So that's what we sometimes refer to as second breakfast. Yeah, the dogs are very good at finding stuff to eat, which you really don't want them to eat. What can I do? What can I say? Especially at breakfast time. So we just kick off with those first verses again, about instruction. So teaching, sometimes the translation is, the actual Hebrew word is Torah. And Torah comes from a root that means to point things out, which is interesting because we've often turned law, because we translate Torah as law, and law is something that's restrictive, it's like boundaries around the edge, whereas actually Torah, if you take its kind of root meaning, to kind of point, is indication, it's instruction. In fact, that's the way I think Jewish communities still translate it. They call it instruction rather than law. Which is useful because actually, of course, we're going to see how actually it's very easy to kind of, as we pursue wisdom, which produces kind of good moral behaviour, to become judgmental, which is why the issue of kindness and truth, or grace and truth, is put there a few verses in. So it's instruction, which is a head thing, it's a wisdom thing, and follow it with your heart, which is an emotional thing. So we're going for the holistic thing, and it will add to your well-being, it will add to the days of your life. And that little summation for me is right at the heart of almost all of the wisdom literature, which is there is a good way to live, there is a right way to live. And in the world that's become so relativistic, we won't accept that anymore. And we try and kind of make the excuse that, well, it's just kind of obvious that you should live in a kind of being nice to people. But actually it's one of the great achievements of the Christian faith, that it took a barbarous people, which is the whole world really, even the Romans, who used that phrase disparagingly, they were pretty barbarous in their slavery, their executions, summary executions, life and death issues. And it produced the world where those who think they can live without God still live on the assumptions of the wisdom that he kind of embeds into us. As we touched on this before, the wisdom works whether you receive him, believe in him or not, but actually it just doesn't last because it's sourced out of the revelation of a God who cares equally for each of us. But there you go. So it hits the head, hits the heart. It produces long life, it produces health, it produces well-being. So, it goes on about binding them around your neck. In other words, it's kind of wearing them and on your chest, I think it is. Which probably, I'm not sure, is probably a reference to kind of priestly clothing. It's kind of, so we're going to be, and of course to be a priest is to be an intercession, an intermediary between creation and creator. So that they become part of what we wear consciously. That you might find favour and understanding and favour, as we said, which is something that we saw Jesus growing in with God and with man, which is all fantastic. And then it's got that verse which is so often quoted kind of on its own, lean not on your own understanding, but acknowledge the Lord, and in all your ways acknowledge him. And it's interesting because it's easy to kind of use that verse in a slightly patronising way with those that we think haven't got much understanding. You're in a difficult situation. Well, you're a bit thick, so don't lean on your own understanding of God's big plan. See, God has a plan, but it's not a blueprint. It's a game plan. It's what makes life interesting. It's what allows him to react to us. If he tied down every detail, he has no reaction to us. There's no point in prayer. But he has a game plan for you. I've touched that in my books, looked at those kind of things, so I won't do it here. But actually, there is a need for that injunction, that particular sort of idea of not leaning on our own understanding. Even more so in a world where we have so much information. And not only information, but so much education. So we have education, and we have human wisdom, and we have human knowledge all over the place. And we need to remind ourselves not to patronise those who don't know, but for those of us who do, not to lean on what we know. Because there are times, and I really have to say, I just sometimes don't get it. I find constantly in my own life it's kind of conflict between my head and heart, living in a world that's got so much information. So how does this verse fit with that kind of thing? And so often we have to kind of let go of things, and in particular it comes to the flow of how you do life. It's easier in the abstract, it's in the process of what should I do today, and then that phrase, in all of your ways acknowledge him, reminds us that in Jewish life there was no separation between sacred and secular. All of life was lived under God, and that idea and concept, and even the word acknowledge, is actually at the root of the word praise. The word praise is just the word to acknowledge. It's the context it's done in, because that's the way Hebrew works. It only has a handful of ideas, about 4,000 words, and you interpret them into English with its kind of 20 plus thousand that most people use, according to context. So to acknowledge in what we think of as a religious context we call praise, but actually all of life is therefore an opportunity for worship, and in all our ways we acknowledge him. In all our ways we're going to acknowledge him. Right, let's keep going, see where we get to this morning. So it goes on, don't be wise in your own eyes, and then it kind of reminds us as well that bit, so fear Yahweh, and we're going to see that concept, particularly the fear Yahweh bit, really comes into focus with the next couple of verses, which are all about how we use our money. So, but it starts again with that, so don't get to the place where you think you're so clever, and it's interesting, you see, because we have to keep ourselves in a place of grace. Remember at the beginning it talks about kindness, so kindness and truth. So truth can be very unkind. You have to temper it with kindness. That's why grace and truth is so key. And if we're going to stay in the place of grace, it does take work. Strange, isn't it? Not works of law, but just actually works of attention, works of worship, if I can put it that way. And so don't get too smart in your own thinking. We do need to keep reverence towards the Lord. We don't treat his grace and his favour towards us as a right, which unfortunately an awful lot do, particularly in the kind of... I'm a great proponent of the priority of grace. We lead with grace and then truth. I think the order is important. But actually the duality is also important. Grace without truth is not grace. It's just the way things are. Grace only makes sense because there is truth. Grace only makes sense because actually the world does kind of work. Even in Christian and Jewish thinking, the world does kind of work with a sort of morning. The world does kind of work in a sort of karmistic type of way. You know, you reap what you sow. You put rubbish in, you get rubbish out. That is the kind of the truth of religion. But the amazing thing is we can go beyond that, you see. And so by grace, we get out what we don't put in. We get what we don't deserve. But if we treat that grace as a right, it becomes the new foundation principle. Something goes wrong at that stage. So we have to maintain fear of Yahweh, that we have grace because of something Yahweh has offered to us, not because instinctively you're worth it. We're worth it because he deemed us worth it. We're worth it because he chose to pay a price, and a very high price. So anyway, you keep going on, it goes on, it starts to talk about generosity and giving. So honouring him with your substance, the best of who you are. Not just one day a week, but the best of who you are, and out of the first fruits of your produce, i.e. what you're producing, your wealth. And so you think straight away, oh, it's all about tithing and giving. And again, we live in a new covenant. And giving hasn't disappeared, it's just now God loves a generous giver. It's given freely. And that's the kind of the challenge, you see. And that's why I think this little verse suddenly pops in there. Which if we're going to stay gracious, we have to actually kind of almost deal with the flesh by living in generous ways, which sometimes we don't want to do. We don't give because we have to anymore. Actually, every price and every debt has been paid, but we give actually out of our relationship with the Lord, and it keeps us generous as we give to those who don't really deserve the amounts we give them. And I know personally, on a level, I'm not a simplistic kind of hey, I've always tithed perfectly. I'm more often than not I haven't. I kind of always give, but the levels go up and down, and I'm very real about how sometimes fear gets in, and so then you kind of cease a little bit. Then you have a mad moment of generosity and you give beyond what the Lord's really asked you to do to kind of make up for it. But actually I do know the truth, and I try to live in it. So I try to challenge myself to live generously, not to kind of just give what people deserve, but to live generously. And the remarkable thing is, you really do, as that verse in Deuteronomy talks about putting it to the test, it really does get put to the test, and it really does work. Grace comes back to you. Cast your bread on the water, it says in Ecclesiastes, and many days it returns. I often thought, I don't know why it says that. Is it like ducks? You can eat a duck because it comes back because you fed it bread the other day, or fish, probably something like that. So there's a challenge, generosity. I just want to see what the dogs are up to over here, and then we'll finish off in a second. Good. So I found a nice, quiet, shady spot. I'll call it shady now because Banjo's got going. It's quiet. And I set my little action camera up. We'll do a sort of panoramic. So you can see I'm Badger Field's that way, and I haven't got a name for this field. Have to think of one. But I thought this would be a good spot, nice quiet spot to do Beat the Tweet. So before we get going, actually the second Beat the Tweet we did. So I'll just remind you of the noise of that bird. Hang on a second. So let's just give it a bit of a moment. Okay, so that was actually a quail. Thank you. Yeah, you knew that, didn't you, Banjo? It was a quail. So that was a quail, common quail. So first one was a pheasant, this one was a quail. Going for the game birds. The dogs love it when they hear the sound of it when I'm recording the videos. So we'll do a different one today. Number 3 wasn't quite so obvious. So this would be the number 4, beat the tweet number 4.
Beat the tweet.
So what bird is this? Because the woodpecker was just a joke. You do get that, don't you? Okay, so what's this bird? Okay, get that one? You can hear it again. What's this? There you go, it should be enough. Okay, if you know, put your answers in the comments below. If you've not already subscribed to my YouTube channel, please do. Banjo, have you? No, you haven't. So you should just stop interrupting, making comments. If you're not going to participate properly, if you're not going to subscribe, just stay quiet. So that told him. That told him. Right, anyway, I've got to do the last few verses and then we'll finish in prayer. We're just going to walk up the west side of Badgerfield, which follows the stream. Banjo's very excited about that. So back to those kind of giving verses, you know. So it says, acknowledge him, honour him with your substance, and from the first of your produce, your barns will be full and things are overflowing. It's that generous thing, and as I was saying, is, you know, when we turn it into a rite, it becomes ugly and religious. But my experience is, you see, in my imperfection in actually living this principle, sometimes I've been incredibly generous. You know, we sold a house, we give a huge amount, thousands and thousands of pounds, and then you feel, oh, I'm so spiritual. And then there's other times and things are a bit tight, and your gifts kind of go right down, and you kind of weigh it all up, and it ebbs and it flows. And you hear the condemnation of verses, you know, test me in this, and those who say, well, you're robbing the Lord if you're not tithing. And we miss the flow of the generosity. But here's my testimony. It's kind of testimony. The Lord has been so incredibly generous to myself and my family in ways that we really do not deserve. But he does it at the times when very often I'm in my worst place in some of those things on the personal level. You know, I often don't feel like I deserve the generosity and grace that he gives over to me. And I can tell you story after story, but some of them are kind of private because I've kind of agreed with people who've stepped in. I've told them the appropriateness of when they've done things for us, and they don't always necessarily want those things shared. But it's tens and tens, literally tens and tens of thousands of pounds of blessing over the years that have come into us at moments when I really didn't feel like I particularly deserved it. It didn't feel like, but that's the whole point. Grace, generosity is not about what you deserve, and it's not a right. It's fear of the Lord. It's a reverence that the Lord actually can gift me beyond what I deserve. And there's something in me that finds that sometimes tricky, you know. And I'm very conscious that the last year has been an incredibly generous year for us, and yet since the strokes and things, and I slow things down, I often feel I don't do anywhere near as much that I used to. I have the privilege and benefit of being able to spend a couple of hours walking the dogs each day. Morning. So so it's been an incredibly generous year, and as I say, I think, what am I doing now? I kind of walk dogs, record some videos, I record some stuff on YouTube, some other teaching. I go up to London and I pastor some folks, and I try and make myself available, and I think to myself, this doesn't feel strategic. I used to organise big events, I used to organise international things, and yet strangely the Lord has blessed this period. All I can say is I want to, I suppose, bear witness and testimony to his faithfulness, which is way beyond what ours is. It's not if I do this, I get that, because that's kind of the religious thing, and that's where it all goes wrong, when it becomes a right. It's when we stop fearing the Lord and saying, actually, I don't deserve it. Your love is not is not a right for me to demand. It is a benefit that I live under, that flows out of your character and your nature. And I love being a beneficiary of that. I really do. It's really good. So we're nearly done with the end of where I'm gonna capture some thoughts and prayers. I think there's another verse that I've missed out, haven't I? I have to check it, and if there is, I'll revisit it. So just that last verse, actually, I knew there was knew there was a final verse, which is about, again, speaking to the son, not to worry when the Lord reproves you. And as I just sort of been sharing from a kind of testimony point of view, the way often the Lord reproves me is by being more generous with me than I am with other people. And I find that kind of sometimes embarrassing. I really do. It's a kind of an interesting way of thinking about challenge. It goes on because there's, actually is the son he delights in whom he reproves. And it's interesting to wonder, therefore, whether Jesus, who is the son he delights in, that little phrase which we find spoken over Jesus as he comes up out of the water, he is a son that God delights in, whether actually he knew the challenge to the things he wanted to do, which I assume he did, because we get that in the Garden of Gethsemane, not my will but yours, which means that there must have been times where in his humanity, not because he's evil but because his perspective is limited, Jesus wanted to do one thing, but actually he knew by the Spirit he had to do something different. Morning. Morning again. Had to do something different. So those are my thoughts on the beginning of chapter 3 of Proverbs. It's a beautiful morning. It's going to wander onto the bridge and cross over into the next field, and I'll probably pray there and give the day to the Lord. So, Father, I want to be challenged again to live generously, to kind of put the flesh under the feet, to live with that grace and generosity that you give to me, you give to all of us. And that's about making sure it's part of our heart, not just our head. Part of the heart, not just the head. So, Father, thank you for another glorious day. Thank you actually just for another day of life. Oh, it's so much better to live and know the flow of all of the energy and information that this universe is made up of, and to know my little tiny moment of it, my tiny speck on a tiny little speck of dust on the western spiral arm of the galaxy, in all of that smallness, but the richness of the grace of God and the goodness of God, to know it today in my heart for eternity, in Jesus' name. Amen. So bless you. This has been Crumbs Under the Table, and I'll see you again in a couple of days' time.